such a nice surprise. Those Godwins, I taught them all the children. And when the last one came up, she said, my mama told me to tell you I'm the last one. They're not going to be anymore. And I thought that sounds like, yeah, fair warning. Yeah, I love the Godwins, though. A lot of A's and some B's, but there's nothing wrong with a B, even though some of us would not be satisfied. But, you know, that's not bad.
Married a cousin.
We've got no, that's a no. Ask Gregor Mendel. You don't believe me. The idea of the last day is always sad, except we have such a special treat ahead of us. And if I'm lucky, you'll be back on March 31st. Not that I am counting the days, but yes, I am, because we've got Scotland ahead and the United Kingdom. We're going to do a lot in the spring. I think it's 7 sessions, actually.
6.
Well, it said 7 weeks.
Well, what do I know?
On the odd, I thought it was very odd.
It is odd.
I thought it was 6. But the happier I get. Yeah, just to think about it. Because we've got to get all the way to the early 18th century. And I know many of us have been to Blenheim Palace. And it costs a lot of money now to take the tour. Well, I guess everything does. But the idea of going all the way through the War of the Spanish Succession until King George I. And you say, but he's not a Stuart. No, he's a Hanoverian. But that's how far we're going. We've got a lot of territory to cover through April. So please come back if you are able, and I will certainly welcome you there. Now, before the special star appears, we are going to talk briefly about, I don't know whether to call it a Cold War or a hot war, but to say that Catholics and Protestants were definitely enemies in the reign of Elizabeth is very clear. And in particular, that symbol of Catholicism, and never forget who he was, the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella. And you say, I know, it's on the tip of my tongue. Yes. If you had to fill in the blank, you would say, Philip II, right? Because you would know. Because remember, he sort of loved his cousin. Remember? Mary? That could be on the phone. So, yeah, keep that in mind. It sounds like a bag of Hoover vacuum, right? It's like that. You know all these things. So, before we get to that, we always like to recall our heroes or scamps or combination thereof. And here's Sir Francis Drake. The reason I mention him is, of course, I think of, you remember the old series Mission Impossible? And how they would always say, if you are captured, the secretary will disavow any knowledge. I always thought that. Sunday nights, I think, whenever it was, I thought that was just too cool. CIA-ish, sort of. And that's sort of like these characters like Francis Drake. They operated against the Spanish, but in many ways, they weren't connected officially with the English government. So they could be, they couldn't be. But Francis Drake had a very interesting career, shall we call it, and a lot of interesting activities during his lifespan, which I think went all the way to the end of the 16th century. And as you see, he got the title of knight, despite relatively humble beginnings. I know that he did get in trouble because I think everybody understood that he was involved with the English government, but more or less, like I say, like something out of the CIA annals, he sort of was doing his own thing in the sense of the Spanish and the English. Why was this going on? Well, we're going to hear more about that from our guest star, the English Navy. But Spain definitely represented not only great wealth, but also Catholicism. And now we're at war. Ooh, I know. I did not realize until the other day that he had been canonized. So maybe I should call him St. Pius. Maybe not.
No.
But whatever the case, can you see that next to him? You see Christ, of course, and the crucifix. But all of this, it seems to me, has to do with struggle and pain and the rest of it. And Pius, who was one of the major figures in what we call the Catholic Reformation, was more or less saying, there's one way, and you better straighten out. He was major in the Council of Trent, and we do call him Pius, but that was a very popular papal name, and it would remain because there have been 12 of them.
That's a lot.
Yeah. More or less, though, he made the decision of excommunicating Queen Elizabeth in that famous year. Judy, you know the year well, 1570. Yeah. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but just so the other folks would know that when I call a year out, I know your hand you just beg to be. Yeah, I know there's just some people who have it. In 1570, thank you. More or less, Philip had asked the Pope not to do it because by doing this, by excommunicating Elizabeth, you recall, Pius is basically saying, not only are you going to hell, but on earth, well, you're just not acceptable. So there's nothing worse than being a Protestant heretic. So it's not like reach out and touch. I know, that's it. Yeah. Damn. And it's not like let's all get a big hug.
Forget about it.
I could sing We Are the World, but I won't. So basically just accept my word for it that this is like war. What is it good for? Nothing. In this case, it's some serious spiritual warfare. And he declares this. He's very excited because we're going to war against the Turks. And we know that there would be some very important victories of the Spanish against the Turks, naval battle. And of course, we know that the English weren't invited because they're at the other end and they're going to hell anyway because they're losers. I'm going to use some bad language. Perhaps our young people wouldn't have heard it. Damned losers. I know. You just close your ears because that's the way it is. I mean, this is really, I mean, in a way, they're as bad as Turks. And that's super bad. So, Protestant, Turk, I don't know. But all of this then is to say this Catholic Reformation involves a great militancy. And we know who that's going to involve because that's going to involve many people, English Catholics, and they will be considered, if I catch you, according to Elizabeth's government, you know what you are? A traitor. You're not merely, and here's a great word, and don't call anybody this, okay? It will really, I don't know, it's not good for your festive mood. You say, you know what you are, a recusant. And they say, I am not. Yes, that would hurt me too, so don't do that. But basically, those are people who are not following the correct religion. And in England, heretofore, people who did not were called recusants. But now, you're a traitor. You're going down. And it won't be, it's not like, oh, it was all just a misunderstanding. I had my rosary and I forgot and I brought it back out. It's like you don't want to be caught with stuff like that, crucifixes or beads or any of that, because you're a traitor because you don't love Queen Elizabeth. Yeah, I do, but I love the Pope too. And I've got mixed love. Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. So you got to be really careful. And that was very useful because Elizabeth, and I guess you could say her government, was very anxious to find any people who supported Pius. Remember, this is Pius V. And you know, Judy, 1570. Don't forget that year. Yeah, you won't forget it because it will be very, very unpleasant. And again, we're capturing them. We find you all and having a secret mass or something, we're coming for you. Okay? And you'll go into court for traitors, not just saying, oh, I wish you hadn't had that mass, or I wish you hadn't had that rosary, or, that kind of thing. No, it's some serious stuff. Now, what had happened? There was a song. I try to bring up songs from a long time ago. And this one, before you're young folks, Secret Agent. Many of you can sing this. I do so in the shower. Only the shower. I do not. Yeah, Linda knows. Linda's got it. But I'm controlling myself today. I'm not going to repeat that. But these are secret agent men. If I say Ignatius Loyola, it will excite some people who are in the room today. Not calling any names, but you know them, and rightly so. They are eminent. They are quite, well, 5-star. It's not because they are Jesuits. Maybe they had wished at one point to be one. I don't know. But they admire them greatly. The Society of Jesus, which is well known for its educational opportunities and apparently for their great learning and
Have you drank it?
I was not going there, but let's just say that in the early days, they were dedicated to plots and not interested in a 6-pack, would they call it? They were interested in doing things to heretics. And who are heretics? Well, they're people who are non-Catholics.
That's right.
Who are deviants. How can you be a deviant? Well, I can tell you exactly. You claim to be Christian and you don't do it Catholic way. And what methods are we going to use? Are we going to use the 4-way test or some sort of way of saying, well, you're good people and yet you're going wrong? No. The only way to get rid of evil is to strike it down. Okay, I mean, it's unfortunate, but it has to be done. So, how did they get in? Well, shoot, I think they were disguised. I mean, like regular people, sort of like Clark Kent, and maybe like, you cross over from France in disguise as lay people. Yeah, it's a nice boat, isn't it? Yeah, this is a great riding ship. Yeah. It's like, but they're plotting when we get over to England. She's going down. She being Queen Elizabeth. And it's not like they're saying, yeah, but if they love her, maybe we should leave Liz alone. No. She's going down, and God will appreciate it very much. So all of that, plus English Catholics, I would call them hardcore, because these people are, many, of course, went over to Elizabeth's side. I know. Old softies. But the hardcore Catholics, who were probably in the closet, I would think. Yeah. Then when those Jesuits come in and say, would y'all like to get together? And maybe they'll use the secret word rosary or something. And they all get real excited when somebody says, says, yeah, go. We have a mass for you. That kind of thing. So, yeah. And they say, oh, we love him. Bravo, ole, Felipe. And you say, oh, the widower. Remember Philip and Mary? I won't say love going wrong, but it was just because he was happily married now to a French woman, Elizabeth Valois. More or less, though, he was the symbol of, anti-Turk and anti-Protestants. They're going to hell and let's send them there prematurely or maturely right now. Maybe in hell they'll thank us for it. But what I know, whatever the case, he was their pinup boy. But Philip was very active at this point. This is the reign of Queen Elizabeth in England. And remember, they had exchanged notes. By ambassador saying, are you interested in perhaps a marriage? And when she said no, he moved on. it would have been a very weird connection. So it didn't happen, but the idea is he is the symbol of militant Catholicism. I think they would have brought out, the Jesuits would have brought out, because the founder of the Jesuits was Spanish. I mean, but there was some serious Catholicism. You didn't find a lot of Spanish Baptists or Methodists. I mean, it's like we are talking seriously Catholic. And so during this period, we find that it becomes very important that, at least in public, if you want to, I guess, keep your head on, keep your body from burning, it is important that you more or less conform to. I love the Book of Common Prayer. That would be a nice thing to say. Rosary, ooh, yeah, that. Yeah, so you have to do a real act as a thespian, you might say. Was this an international movement? Well, never like the Catholics, because the Catholics obviously centered in Rome. And of course, at that time, boy, those Jesuits could not get enough. I mean, they were like wearing, I heart the Pope, I know it's like, it changed over years. I mean, sort of like maybe yes, maybe no. But not at this time. It's all about go Pope, go Big P, and all the rest. Yeah. But Protestants clearly tend to be divided. We start with Lutherans, and then it spreads to various groups, Calvinists, as you know, and Anabaptists, and all the rest. The question is, though, if the Jesuits, the Pope, and the Spanish government are going to be aiding these English deviants who are going to hell, is there something we could do against them? You want to hurt us? Then you better watch out. And that's what I thought was interesting to see, an area that many of you will be very familiar with because of your own travels. I know you think of tulips and wooden shoes and the beauty of, well, it won't be long, will it, when the tulips are blooming and everybody's out, Amsterdam and all the rest. But this is a little less pleasant. These Habsburgs, we always associate them, I guess, with Spain. But thanks to marriage, they've got all these lands in what we call the Netherlands and Belgium, for 19th century people, because there was no Belgium until the 19th century. So all of this is to say that Philip had his own Protestants to deal with in what we call today the Netherlands, or somewhat incorrectly Holland.
Much incorrect.
Yeah, I know. But it happens. People say it, and I don't. You don't want to hurt people's feelings. You just say, I know what you mean. Because that's one of the states. All of this is to be noted that these people, should I say, annoy Philip II, because he would like, obviously, for everybody to be Catholic. And of course, he spends a lot of time in Spain, where after all, he's the king. So the rebellion, which actually will ultimately be successful and create, of course, the Dutch nation, which will become, as you know, filthy rich and an enemy of the British in terms of trade and power, is going to be aided by the English. The idea is you're Protestant, we're Protestant, and considering the rivalries of the British and the Dutch in the future, because I'm afraid money and land will supersede religion. But in the early days of the Dutch uprising against the Spanish, Elizabeth will send funding and provide for them. Now, when you look at the map, you can see yourselves how it'll all work out. That area closer to France will become, well, they call them the Spanish Netherlands, Catholic. And that, of course, is the lovely home of Brussels. And many of you have been to Belgium, so you know. But it didn't become Belgium in the 19th century. Just repeat that. But it's interesting. And then north, I don't know if you think of the Netherlands as being particularly Protestant nowadays, but it was a great bastion. So, I mean, it's like you want to hang out with people who are religiously more like you, I guess the Anglo-Dutch connection is important. On the other hand, you want trade rivalries and disputes of that sort, we can do that too. So, very interesting that way. So, the Dutch had enjoyed Elizabeth government support big time. But meanwhile, this is kind of interesting to me, the Huguenots. And you see the map? I thought the map was so helpful here because look way down there in the yellow in the south of France. That was big Huguenot. And they had nobility, all kinds of people. They were Calvinists. And you say, what are you doing in a Catholic country like that? Well, it's not comfortable. Not comfortable at all. And of course, France, more or less, largely Catholic. Elizabeth, interestingly to me, did not get seriously involved there because I guess the fear that it would be a waste of money, considering, regardless, Protestant, Catholic, they don't want us back. It's not like we can hang out with them and they'll say, oh, please, please, we've missed you. Come to Calais, come to Bordeaux, Normandy, maybe. No French would want that, whether Protestant or Catholic. But the Huguenots enjoyed, at the early stages, the English support simply because, I guess you'd say, English rivalry against the French government. It's just a natural thing to do. On the other hand, that doesn't mean that the English were expecting to be welcomed by any French, Protestant or Catholic. So it was a very weird situation for the English there, for Queen Elizabeth, because France is not Spain. Because Spain is Catholic all the way, go Big P, and all of that. The French, somewhat. Because I don't think, like I say, they know a lot of Spanish Baptists. And France, this Huguenot movement can be fairly significant enough, especially when they have upper class people with nice bank accounts. And so, what we can do, we can put up a good fight against our enemies. So it's fair to say then the warfare is going on outside England, while it's going on inside England as well, thanks to Jesuits and their friends. I'm not saying the Society of Jesus wasn't doing it out of love. I mean, they loved, and they did more than drink spirits. Which is a modern day
That's a
vice. Yeah, I'm not thinking they sat around. What they have 6-packs ordered to there.
They have the Heineken truck regularly.
Okay. Yeah, he knew Jesuits personally. Kind of jealous, but that is not necessarily a good thing, because the Jesuits of the 16th century are more involved in scholarship, not Heineken's.
Yeah.
And they are seriously pursuing the truth as they see it. And I love Pius V. St. Ignatius Loyola, Roll Call of Honor. Philip II, I Think I Love You. Remember that song? Yeah, it's an old song. But anyway, it's important for us to appreciate these figures as we look at the amazing empire. I thought these maps were somewhat helpful to understand that even in Elizabeth's reign, we have the beginnings of an empire for England. Now, if you ask the Spanish or Portuguese, they're going like, yeah, it's okay. Not like us. Because remember, you know this from your grade school history, the Spanish and Portuguese were way ahead of everybody else in the empire building. But we got to start somewhere, and it's, of course, the reign of Queen Elizabeth. And it's very, very significant, because once you taste it, colonialism, you got to satisfy it. It's a habit. Take somebody. And so the trade routes, Africa, Asia, New World, all of this will become very, very important. Finally, Sir Walter Raleigh, many of us, last with Sir Francis Drake, think of him. If you were to go out in College Street tonight and ask students whether they would be more interested in Sir Francis Drake or Sir Walter Raleigh.
Neither.
Well, that's not a choice. You can't do that.
That's hard.
Because that would hurt their feelings. Because they would say, but I know, I care deeply about Sir Walter Raleigh. Now, yes, the vice of tobacco comes in this period. But they brought it over. Because we often think about, Virginia and that area. And they actually had a brand, I guess, 50s, somewhere, called Raleigh cigarettes, believe it or not. And I kept thinking, I wonder if you brought out a package and it had Sir Walter, if consumers would come here and Ask me, ask me. I know. I'm just imagining.
You're bad.
Yeah, no, that is strictly imagination. But Sir Walter Raleigh, famed for chivalry and all the rest, always learned that at school, don't we? About the perfect gentleman and the queen and all the rest. Was another one of the sorts who enjoyed her favor at times and would become well known during the reign. And now, for our special treat, we are fortunate to have Linda and Frank back from their journey. And we are fortunate enough that Frank, who is quite knowledgeable in the area of military history, can tell us about the showdown. I will use a vulgar analogy. You know this, even young people know this. The OK Corral. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, thank you, Wild West people. Yeah, yeah. So we're gonna have it coming. The Spanish versus the English. Yeah, people can get hurt. And we love you, and yet we have to do this. Someday you'll think, well, maybe not, unless maybe in the next world. Are you ready, sir?
Sure, why not?
We are so lucky to have Sir Frank.
Let me get to my number here. And there.
There we go.
Okay. Well, obviously, I'm going to speak about the Spanish Armada, and I got a couple of notes that I like to make sure I get everything together. But really, in my world, the defeat of the Spanish Armada is one of the most important naval battles in military history, if not world history. It's that important. This battle is the beginning, I would say, of a new empire on which the sun will never set. And let's talk a little bit about realistically what's going on at this time. As we've talked a little bit in this class, Philip II is the leader of the largest, richest, most important nation in Europe. Very, very, very powerful army and a relatively powerful navy as well. And where that wealth is coming from is primarily from the New World. And he is considered, though, to be the first emperor which has an empire on which the sun never sets. And his empire, as you saw in that map, is quite large, is larger, obviously, than England's at the time, particularly deriving wealth from the New World. So what is going on here is simply this, is that Philip II has some major issues with England. Of course, as England is supporting the Dutch Revolution in the Netherlands. That is a huge problem. England is supporting, really, privateers, in other words, pirates, to rob those treasure fleets coming from the New World. That's a big problem because that's where Spain is deriving most of its wealth. So they can't have that going on. And incredibly important is England is a Protestant country. And that is just something that Philip cannot accept. Again, Philip is incredibly tight with the Pope. And you look at Elizabeth, and the way the Pope looks at Elizabeth. And simply this is Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, and her mother, Anne Boleyn, that marriage is not sanctioned by the church. This makes Elizabeth illegitimate, and therefore, as illegitimate, she cannot be the ruler of England in the eyes of the Catholic Church. So we have those three major issues for Philip going into this. And he has to do something about it. It's hurting him economically, it's hurting him on the continent, and it's hurting him with the church. So those three issues are very important to him and to Spain itself. So they're going to have something called the Enterprise of England. And the Enterprise of England is going to be a fleet of 130 ships that are going to go up the English Channel and are going to meet a large, powerful army, probably the most powerful in Europe, led by the Duke of Parma in the Spanish Netherlands. That idea is then what they will do is they will have that army transported, protected by the Armada to get to Kent. From Kent, they will march on London and depose the Queen and return England to the Catholic faith. So that is what is going on here. Well, we need to think about this because most people, when they think about the Spanish Armada, they think of this giant fleet that's much larger than the English fleet, and it's like the plucky little English fleet wins the day. Well, actually, the Spanish Armada consisted of, like I say, 130 ships. The English initially are vastly outnumbered, but as time goes on, as they march up the English Channel, the English fleet actually starts to outnumber them at 197 ships. So kind of a misnomer that this is a hugely overmatched, plucky English. But what they do have is they're going to have a different type of idea of how they're going to fight. And we'll talk about that in detail. In that they have on the Spanish fleet 19,300 soldiers. The English only have 1,500 soldiers. So there's a difference in how things are going to take place as far as these fleets are operated. But I think what's very unusual is this number here: oarsmen, servants, and others. Does anybody have any thoughts on who those others might be? 1,600 clergy. So they are going to make sure that England once again becomes a Catholic country. Well, let's talk a little bit about the ships themselves. I think that's very important how this battle goes on. And we'll start with Spanish warships, which are considered to be Spanish galleons. I prefer to refer to them as Mediterranean galleons. A Mediterranean galleon is, in effect, a dual-purpose ship. It is a cargo ship and a warship in one piece. As a cargo ship, it's got a very wide ship. It has a very deep draft. It draws a lot of water. So it also has another feature. And if you look at the top picture, you'll see I have highlighted two things. That is a forecastle and a stern castle. And the word castle is appropriate because that's what they are. Because these ships are designed for the traditional type to fight a war at sea from time immemorial. And that is simply that naval battles are land battles at sea. Ships will come together, you will grapple, and then your infantry will go and fight it out on the deck. So the idea of having castles is infantry needs high ground. So it's much easier to defeat your enemy if you've got the high ground than it is if you're down flat. So that is why these castles are built. But that's going to put severe limitations on these vessels' capabilities. Again, they're wide, they're deep draft, they have large wind-resistant castles. So these ships are top-heavy, they're slow, and they're relatively non-maneuverable. But they don't, in their world, they don't need to be. That's because they're going to have an infantry battle. The English have a significantly different idea, and this is a very new idea. And they're going to build a thing called the race-built galleon. The race-built galleon is, and again, don't get the impression that all of the English fleet is race-built galleons. It's not. But a portion of it is. And what is different about these, if you look at the picture, there's no castles. It's a much lower ship, so it's much less wind resistance. Its beam, in other words, how long and thin it is much greater than a Spanish Mediterranean-style galleon. That's going to make this ship a lot faster and a lot more maneuverable. And what these ships actually are is they're not cargo ships, they're warships. They're built to carry weapons, guns, cannon. So let's talk a little bit about the cannons. And the English use really a French designed weapon, not 100% again. Don't get the impression that all their guns are like this. They have a percentage of these, and they're called culverins. And that is a longer barreled cannon that fires a smaller cannonball. What that allows it to do is to fire at a very long distance. So they have long range cannon on these. And that is going to be very, very important. But what's actually much more important is the carriage of this gun. If you look closely at the carriage, you can see it's on 4 wheels. These guns are not breech loading weapons like you have today. These are muzzle loading weapons. So in other words, you have to load that thing from the front of it. So when that gun fires on 4 wheels, it rolls backwards. And then ropes stop it from going too far. And then you can get to the front of it and reload it. And it becomes very quick firing compared to the Spanish gun, as you see below there. The Spanish gun is on 2 wheels with a traditional type of carriage that you would see on a land battle. So the English guns are going to be able to fire much, much faster. So that's an advantage for the English. But the Spanish, really, they don't care. Because the Spanish guns have a completely different idea of how these should be used. The Spanish think what you need is a very large cannonball. And that cannonball doesn't have a lot of range, but you don't want a lot of range because you're going to come right up next to your enemy and you're going to blast them at point blank range, and then you're going to board that enemy and have that land battle at sea. So they really aren't that concerned about it. The other problem with these as far as reloading is they don't roll back. And with that carriage like that, it's much longer, so it's harder to get it back in. But again, that's not really what they're worried about. A couple other features here. If we look at the top picture, you'll notice that the English gun is made out of iron. Now, iron in a cannon at this time is a problem because it tends to fracture. The English have somewhat solved that problem. You know, what's happened is when you fire a cannon and it fractures, you don't want to be next to it, believe me. So that's not a good thing. So, but they've kind of fixed that problem. Also, they're kind of making these to a standard. So they're firing basically the same size cannonball. The lower gun you can see there is made of bronze. The Spanish guns are made of bronze. Now, bronze is much more effective in the fact that it doesn't fracture. Why would you make cannon out of iron? Because to make cannon out of iron, they cost 1/10 what it costs to make a bronze cannon. So the English don't have nearly as much money as the Spanish, so they can make a heck of a lot cannon for a heck of a lot cheaper. Also, the Spanish guns tend to be kind of a hodgepodge. They fire different sized cannonballs. And the fact is, they actually have found gauges on Spanish ships to fit the size of the cannonball to the particular gun you're firing. So you don't get the wrong size cannonball when you're in the middle of a battle. The question is, how do we know all this? We know this from wrecks. On the English side, we have the Mary Rose, which I've talked about, and the Battle of Agincourt, where we saw the English had longbows, where they also had iron cannon. Not again 100%, but they had an iron cannon. And that ship sank in 1545. So that's well before the Spanish Armada. So they were already beginning to make iron cannon standardized on their ships at that time. We know a little bit about the guns on the Spanish side from the wreck of the La Trinidad Valenciana, which was destroyed off the coast of Ireland. And in that wreck, they see these bronze guns of multiple sizes. They see these 2-wheel carriages of what's left of them, and they see those gauges. So realistically, when we look at this battle, the English have a large advantage in the ability of their cannon to fire quickly and at longer range. But cannon are not going to be the main reason that the Spanish lose so many ships. It's going to be the humble anchor. So we'll continue. Now let's talk about command and control. And I think the English command and control is very important in this. And we talk about this gentleman here, Sir John Hawkins, and I think he's rather overlooked. Most people will talk about Howard. Most people will talk about Sir Francis Drake. Hawkins is actually third in command of the English fleet. And Hawkins is a relatively, I would say, unsavory character by today's standards. Hawkins is a slaver. He's gone on 3 slave voyages. He has financed a 4th. But being a slaver is pretty much acceptable in this time frame. Even Queen Elizabeth herself has profited from the slave trade. So as much as we find this reprehensible, it's the way it was back then. But he is a great sailor. He's been to the New World. He's fought the Spanish. He knows what they need. He knows what they need are ships that are different than what they've been using. The reason simply is that if you're going to attack a Spanish treasure fleet, you need something that's fast so you can catch it. You need something that can outmaneuver it. And also, you don't necessarily have that many soldiers aboard where you can afford the losses that you're going to sustain by having a land battle at sea. So quite honestly, he comes up with a better idea, which is the race-built galleon. So he's the guy, because he was treasurer of the Navy, that begins to build those race-built galleons. That's going to be such a tremendous change for the English fleet at this time. The other people that I need to mention, of course, are Howard. He's a great sailor. Sir Francis Drake, he's a bold pirate in effect. And so the English command is a bunch of people that know how to sail, they know how to fight, and they know how to take chances. Well, Spain a little different. They have this guy to be in charge of the Spanish Armada, and he's the Duke of Medina Sidonia. Now, he should not have been in charge of this, but the man who should have been, who's Admiral Santa Cruz, he unfortunately has died. Philip II decides, I think I'm going to put Medina Sidonia in charge. And why does he do that? Because Medina Sidonia is a staunch Catholic. And Philip believes, there's no doubt about it in my mind, he believes that he's got God on his side and he needs a staunch Catholic in order to make this fleet successful. Well, I'm sorry to say that Medina Sidonia doesn't really see it that way. He's one of the richest men in Spain. He is a tremendous administrator. He's not an admiral. And he actually writes a letter to Philip. He says, I'm really not qualified to have this job. Okay, this is something I shouldn't be doing. And, oh, by the way, I have a really bad tendency to get seasick. And apparently this letter, they say it never reached Philip, and Philip's advisors hid it from him, and nobody really knows. But regardless, this guy is now in charge of the Spanish Armada. Now, great administrator. Is he a bold sailor? Is he a great admiral? Is he a sea captain? He's none of those things. But what he is going to do is he's going to follow orders, and he's not going to take any chances. And that's going to be a big problem. So let's look at this thing in pieces. So the first piece is simply here. The Armada has to get to the Spanish Netherlands. They have to get Parma, who's on flat-bottom barges. So these aren't warships. They need to be escorted to England, where then they will land, and then they will defeat the English and get rid of Elizabeth and return this country to Catholicism. There are going to be 4 main battles. The first one will be on the 31st of July, and that will be at Plymouth. The next will be at the 2nd and 4th of August off the Isle of Wight. The third will be at Calais, and that is on August 7th. And then Gravelines, which is the decisive battle, will be on August 8th. So let's take a look at each one of these individually. But first, look at this picture, because this is critical to understand what this is about. You notice this crescent-shaped formation. That is the formation of the Spanish Armada. The idea of that formation is that if somebody comes in there, they can surround them, then they can board them, then they can have the land battle. Always what they want to have to do. You can see the English to the left of that are in a long, stringy line. Well, what happens is the Armada gets into basically the beginning of the English Channel. And at this point, they have 122 ships because 8 ships have been forced to turn back because of a storm. So you got 122 ships. There are 55 English ships in the port of Plymouth. Problem for the English. There's a flood tide and there's no wind. The English fleet is trapped in port. They can't get out. They have no way to get out. With the flood tides coming in and no wind to get through it. So they're stuck there. Had Medina Sidonia been the aggressive admiral that the Spanish would have needed, what he should have done is he should have taken that fleet and sailed into Plymouth Sound. The English can't maneuver, and then he could have used his overwhelming capability of infantry. Remember, he's got 19,000 infantry. They've got 1,500. That infantry then would destroy the English fleet in port, and that would have been the one chance that they had to win this battle. Unfortunately, he is not a bold commander, and he sails on past Plymouth, following his orders. Now, it takes an incredibly bold commander to take a fleet of that size into a harbor you don't know. You don't have pilots, so you don't know if there's sandbars or whatever there. But a bold admiral may have done that, and that would have been the end of England as we know it today. But that doesn't happen. Finally, the English fleet gets out of port and begins to chase the Spanish crescent, and there's some minor skirmishing at long range with cannon, and nothing really happens. But that was the one chance that the Spanish had to win this battle, in my opinion. Well, then we have the Isle of Wight. So what happens next is the Armada has to take a break. They need to send cutters to talk to Parma, because Parma doesn't know where they're at. Again, there's no communication. So he takes a break, basically. He puts his fleet in the lee of the island of Wight and sends a couple of cutters to get a hold of Parma and say, hey, we're coming, we're right here. And waits a couple days, no response, and figures, well, I better keep moving. So he sails back out into the channel. And again, the English skirmish with him. Again, it's relatively long range and very little damage is done. The Spanish do lose 2 ships. One ship has a collision with another Spanish ship, and that wrecks its rigging. And so then it's left behind and it's surrounded by the English and it surrenders. And the other ship has a magazine explosion. In other words, there's an explosion in its ammunition storage. And nobody knows why, but that was the end of that. So they lose 2 ships. Again, that's not much losses so far for 2 major battles. Okay, forgot to move that. Anyway, got to get to Parma. And the issue with getting to Parma is this. Parma is in the port of Dunkirk. And Dunkirk's really shallow. I don't know if anybody here has seen the movie Dunkirk, but there's a thing called a mole where they're getting loaded up on. It's like a giant pier, in effect, and it goes way out into the water. The reason it's there is because Dunkirk is so incredibly shallow. Well, that mole hadn't been built until the early 19th century, so it's 300 years away. Doesn't exist at this point. So Parma's got these little flat-bottom barges. And the Armada can't get into the port because they are deep draft Mediterranean galleons. And so what they have to do is they have to sail out there. Well, between them is a bunch of these guys, little Dutch flyboats. And little Dutch flyboats are shallow draft, very able to navigate in these shallow waters, and they're armed with maybe 8 to 10 cannon each. So the barges have no chance against these flyboats. They can't leave the port. So the whole plan that Philip II came up with is useless. They can't get out to sea. They can't get past the flyboats. The Armada can't come in to get the flyboats. So they're basically Palmerston is trapped regardless of what the Armada does. So the whole idea is basically faulty. That's pretty strange by today's standards, but that's kind of how it went down. So much so that Palmer gets a note out to Medina Sidonia and says, hey, by the way, could you send me 50 flyboats so we can get rid of these Dutch? And, well, we don't have 50 flyboats. We don't have any flyboats. So they're basically trapped in harbor by these little Dutch flyboats. So the Dutch do play a huge part in this. So what's Palmer to do? He's stuck there. What's Medina Sidonia to do? He's not sure. And so he anchors off Calais. He can't get into Calais, but he anchors off in a sheltered area by Calais. And all his ships are at anchor. And it's nighttime, and they're in a very tight formation. And the English by this time are starting to get more and more reinforcements. In fact, another 40 ships have joined them. And they come up with an idea. They're like, we need to bust up that crescent. So what we're going to do is we're going to create fire ships. And a fire ship is simply this. They take a ship and they load it up with pitch and they load it up with anything flammable they can get their hands on. And they have 8 of these, and they sail these things at night into the Spanish fleet. And then right before they get to the fleet, they light them on fire, and everybody gets on a boat and rows away to get away. And these things are coming into the Spanish fleet. Spanish completely panicked because the last thing you need with a wooden ship is a fire. They panicked so much they need to get out of there. They can't. These things are coming. They cut their anchors. They cut their anchors and they go out at night into the middle of out of the sheltered area into the channel. So when morning comes, they're completely disorganized. They're not in their crescents and they don't have their anchors. And that starts the Battle of Gravelines. So the English, using their faster, heavily armed, more mobile fleet, begin to pick these Spanish ships apart. They begin to blast it. They get it much closer range now because they know the Spanish can't do anything to them because they're not in the crescent. So they begin to isolate ships and shell them aggressively, and they're causing massive amounts of casualties, doing tremendous amounts of damage to the Spanish fleet, not necessarily sinking ships so much, but certainly putting them in a bad position. Then a wind comes up. And the wind comes up and it's forcing the Spanish ships towards the shoals of Zealand. The Spanish ships don't have anchors. They can't stop. So what they're going to do at that point is they're going to head out into the North Sea. That's the only thing they can do. They can't go back into the channel. They can't anchor and reorganize. They're forced into the North Sea. And that's going to be their final demise. This battle really sinks or destroys, better way to put it, 3 to 5 of the Spanish ships at this point. But a lot of them are heavily damaged and have heavy casualties. That's going to lead to the finale of this. In effect, this is over. The only thing the Spanish can do at this point is to begin to sail home. And the only way they can sail home is by sailing all the way around Scotland, past Ireland, and then back to Spain. They don't have charts, and they're not prepared to do this. And then what comes up is the famous Protestant wind. The Protestant wind is giant storms in the Atlantic, because they're in the Atlantic now, and it starts to drive their ships against the shore of Ireland. They don't have anchors, again, so they can't stop themselves from being driven ashore. And at that point, they lose 24 to 35 more ships shipwrecked in Ireland. Problem for those shipwrecked sailors and soldiers is the English are very, very afraid that they will start a revolt in Ireland, and they begin to round them up and slaughter them. So not only are you shipwrecked, but you're executed as well. Now, what finally happens is, of the 122 ships that went into the channel, only 60 ever returned to Spain. The others that are unaccounted for are just lost at sea. And again, with all their crews. So this is a complete and total disaster for the Spanish. It's a nightmare. Well, what about Elizabeth? Well, Elizabeth, 12 days after Gravelines, has her army together. It's about 4,500 to 5,000 men. Now think about that. If Parma lands 30,000, she's not in a good position, to put it mildly. I would say that if Parma would have landed, we would know it would be a Catholic England today. There's no question of that in my mind. But I think this is really something that says a lot about the times, because she says this: I know I have the body but of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm. Pretty bold words for somebody with a 5,000 person army, but that's what she says. Well, actually, what's interesting too then is the next day she finds out about Gravelines, and disbands the army. Well, we don't need that, so everybody go home. But before that, she says, I know already for your forwardness you have deserved rewards and crowns, and we do assure you on a word of a prince, they shall be duly paid. Well, sorry to say that she can't really show for that, because what's going to happen when the English fleet returns is not pretty. The English fleet went out quickly, so they weren't really prepared for a long sea voyage. So they didn't have proper food, they didn't have enough water, they didn't have a lot of things. And they sailed all the way up into the North Sea chasing the Spanish for quite some time. So what happens then is, because of poor hygiene, poor food, they all start to come down with typhus and scurvy. So much so that when they get back to England, they don't have any money and they don't have any food. And by the way, Elizabeth's government doesn't really have any money to give them. So even though she promised that she was going to, everybody's going to get a bunch of money, sorry to say that doesn't really happen. And actually, Charles Howard, who was, again, in command of the whole fleet, actually uses his own money to start paying the sailors so they can afford food. And so during the battle, it's believed that maybe 100 English soldiers were killed fighting the Armada. When they come back, 3,000 to 8,000 die from disease. So it's kind of a sad event there. But I just thought it was interesting that she makes this promise and yet can't really show for it at all. Well, in conclusion, I think the defeat of the Spanish Armada is going to be the birth of a new naval superpower. If we look at trade at this time, the Mediterranean for thousands of years has been the key trade route for the European continent. In the 16th century, this will radically change. Remember, Spain is the richest, most powerful country in the world, primarily because it's extracting wealth from the New World and then shipping that wealth across the Atlantic. So the Atlantic becomes the key to world trade. the British are going to defeat them with warships that are faster, that are more maneuverable, and heavily armed with cannon. This is a new type of warfare, and this type of warship will dominate navies for the next 300 years. There will no longer be land battles at sea. That's a huge change, too. And when we think about England, where is England located? Off the coast of Europe. A perfect position for them to dominate the trade. Also, the English Channel and the North Sea act as a moat. So as long as England has a strong navy, she's protected from being attacked from European powers. This allows England to have a great amount of time for them to develop their economy and for them to develop colonies of their own. And so for the next, I'd say 300 years, well into the early 20th century, England will dominate the trade routes of the world. And so she, because of this battle, once again becomes, I hate to say this again, but a new empire on which the sun never sets. Thank you.
That's right, boss. Oh,
So,
wrong way.
wrong way, sorry.
There you go.
I have to leave you with a tree. It's all I have after Frank's brilliant presentation. I know. But remember, we're getting ready for the spring. We're in March. What's better than a nice tree? And why would we care about trees? Well, Elizabeth doesn't have children, no husband. And yeah, so no cousins. And so it's all about where do we go for an heir? And then you think about if someone, namely that Scottish woman who was headless, like Elizabeth's mother, you know, it's bad to get your head chopped off, but it happened. I don't know whether it's better to go down with the ship, but whatever, whatever the case, finally, after years of stalling, Elizabeth, long past the age of childbearing, had to acknowledge, irony of ironies, that her successor was going to be Mary's son. And you're going like, what? Are they going to get together and have a hug? I've always loved my Stewart's theory. You all are wonderful. They never met. But let's face it, and you who know trees well, look at this, and I know you can say it by heart. You're good. I admire that. And look at that and go all the way down, and then think about, get to the bottom. There's Mary Queen of Scots. We all love her. And then there he is, Cousin Jamie. And they had little notes. Hi, I'm Liz, and I plan to make you king in the dubious chance that I die. I mean, probably isn't going to happen, but you can sit up there in that Edinburgh, yuck, and someday maybe this will be yours. Oh, I love you, Queen. I love you, Queen. You're so wonderful. sycophant. Yeah. Yeah. And it happened, and he finally got it. And you know, there's another old song. It was called "We're in the Money." You heard of that from the old movie? Yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. And you could just see James up there in Edinburgh say, "Yes, I love Scotland." No, not the Scots, but they are sort of like not as, shall we say, advanced as the English. So it's like, gosh, I love my cousin Liz, but I heard the latest medical reports are not good. Because she's not feeling well. It's sort of like they gather around the bed. The last well, not to think of one of my HBO series, but it happens. So that is how that comes about. And I don't believe, I'm not aware that there was a lot of competition because obviously he had it. I mean, the irony being, of course, his mother had her head chopped off by the decision of a queen whose mother had her head chopped off. Think about, that's kind of ironic, but it happens in families. Chopping of heads. And then, of course, I think Frankie already had this
I gave you a new picture.
photograph. She died in 1603. I'm thinking there was never a question. I mean, they got around. Oh, I can't. This is just so sad. But she had had a very long and successful reign. I think you would agree in terms of the Tudors. She was probably the longest ruling monarch of all of them. And you think how they started out from Henry VII and how far they had gone. It's amazing when you think about her mother and how it all happened. And of course, a lot of, shall we say, IOUs that would have to be fulfilled in the future. But that wasn't her problem. She would be in Elizabethan heaven and not having to worry about all of it. That was someone else's problem. And there were serious problems for him. And he would be King James VI of Scotland. As I say, it had got to be a wonderful ride southward because as much as we love Scotland, because I don't really know how often he had ever been to England before, but he would meet a certain large number of issues and concerns, and that's where we're going. Starting on March 31st. So don't forget, be here, please. I look forward to it then. Thank y'all very much. I appreciate it.